Great. Well, thanks for everyone just jumping on this webinar. This is our second in the series of Complete Communities Vision Zero webinars. And so we'll be focusing on um, low cost strategies and treatments. And I'm just really encouraged by all the participation, not only from the municipalities in Milwaukee County, but also our stakeholders and even some of our consultants are on this webinar. So definitely want to thank the team from Tool. It was Beth and team. We'll get into their side of the presentation, and then also our panelists. I really thank you for just sharing your expertise with all of us here in Milwaukee County. We're so grateful. It's been a real education to learn about Vision Zero. Now that Milwaukee County is committed to Vision Zero by 2037, we need all the help that we can get. And so, this is a great way to learn more. So with that, I'll hand it back over.
Right. Thanks, Jeff.
Excellent.
Okay, so I said this out loud, but just in case, if you haven't, we'd love to hear who all is here today. And we know sometimes there are multiple people on one account. So it'd be great if in the chat you can share your name. I didn't say position earlier, sorry, your position, the community you're with, and your go-to summer beverage. That would be great. And while folks are sharing that, so on this webinar today, we have a team from Tool Design and some folks representing local government to help talk about low cost strategies to help implement Vision Zero. My name is Beth Rosenbarger. I'm a senior planner with Tool Design, and my background is in local government. I live in Bloomington, Indiana, and I worked in local government here for 12 years. And my team member Nate is going to join me in presenting today. And Sazia is here, and she is our lead on facilitating the chat. And then we have Bart with the Village of Shorewood, Bradley with the City of Chicago, and I think unfortunately we'll check in, but Ember had something personal come up last minute, and we'll have to check back in on that. So today, we're going to talk about low cost strategies to implement Vision Zero. I'm going to talk about internal government policies, zoning codes, public space programming, and demonstration projects. Then we're going to hear from our panelists who can talk about or who will be talking about demonstration projects as low cost strategies and how those have worked in their communities. So our motto today is a quote that I love. When you realize you're digging a hole, the first thing to do is stop digging. So I think a lot of Vision Zero and honestly transportation work can feel overwhelming because capital projects are expensive, unfortunately. But there are also just lots of things that are our set policies and everything that's in place that has gotten us to the point where we are today. So when we think about stop digging or like let's like stop contributing to what got us here and we can work on fixing and retrofitting all the streets that we need to fix and retrofit. So I'm going to talk about some internal government policies. And when I say internal government policies, I mean um, written and unwritten policies that contribute to how your local government works and functions. So you all are Vision Zero communities, and a really big strategy you can implement, especially people at leadership levels in local government, is vision alignment between departments. So as a Vision Zero community, it's really important to get all of your departments on board with those values and with that mission. And I say that because, we know city government has to happen across a lot of departments. So maybe one department is designing all the street projects and another department is cleaning streets or repaving. Where I worked, we had a planning department, an engineering department, a public works department, and also utilities. And all of these departments had an impact on the streets. But if we needed to have some vision alignment so that it wasn't one department leading and other departments just getting mad at people making it harder or something like that. So I think leadership has a real role to play here in terms of bringing all the departments on board and understanding that you're all together working toward this. I also think between departments and the vision alignment, promoting mode shift, so thinking about more people walking, biking, and using transit as part of the strategy for Vision Zero. So I know we can focus a lot on reducing crashes and getting to zero fatalities and serious injury crashes, but mode shift is a part of that too. The more we reduce driving, that can be really important. Another part of internal government policies can be the way we measure and track success or the way we measure and track and report on success and progress. Most of the time, we tend to focus on what are called lag measures, and those are the outcomes or the results we want to see. So, as a Vision Zero community, we want to see zero fatalities or serious injury crashes in our community. But if we want to track that and report on it ahead of crashes happening, we have to identify different actions that we could report on before crashes happen. So, and these are actions that can help reduce that outcome. So, let's say you would report on how much of your budget is going to improve sidewalks or to repair and replace sidewalks in your community. How many intersections do you budget and plan for a year in order to review and improve the safety of those intersections? Or how many demonstration projects are you budgeting for and able to implement in a year? So those are actions that you can take and that we can measure or report on ahead of time before we wait on the outcome. So another strategy that in a certain way doesn't cost money, but I also know it does because I'm talking about budget, is having a recurring budget, like a specific budget dedicated to Vision Zero. It could be to capital projects, it could be to demonstration projects. Anything within Vision Zero, having a set and recurring budget is very useful in terms of success in the long run. It's difficult to prioritize projects or to plan ahead when you can't predict what your budget is going to be year to year. So I know this can be really challenging for communities, but places that really plan and set aside a budget find more success here. There's a great report from NACTO called Structured for Success, and it talks about a lot more of these internal government policies and structures to help communities be successful. One more internal city policy is that most cities and towns have fleet vehicles. So these could be the vehicles that city workers use. If you provide city workers with vehicles, like to go on site visits or do different things, it can also be fire trucks and police vehicles or trash trucks and other public works vehicles. So we know most vehicles are getting more dangerous to pedestrians and bicyclists, and taking an inventory of your fleet and then making a policy about how vehicles are replaced could help. And that's just an internal policy. If you want to go replace your whole fleet all at once, that's great. And that would be amazing. But because this is low cost, we would say like vehicles all have a life. And as you replace those vehicles, replace them with something that is safer for people walking and biking. Again, there's a great report from NACTO about this too. But what you look at first is right sizing the vehicle. So, what's the smallest size vehicle that can do this job? And then vehicles could have safety features like automated emergency braking. And then, especially with the bigger vehicles, thinking about trash trucks, fire trucks, and other service vehicles like that, there are designs where the driver is much closer to the front of the vehicle and it's flat. And those have better safety outcomes and better visibility in order to see people walking and biking. Okay, switching gears, zoning codes. Again, this is considered a low cost strategy because you probably already have a zoning code. You maybe review it and make updates to it on a regular basis. And these are just some ways to think about reviewing and updating it. Um, Also, I'll say with low cost, we recognize that all of these include staff time, and that is a real resource, and your time is valuable. So I just want to note that. But when we think about zoning, this could be an entire webinar on its own, and then each category that I talk about within zoning could also be a webinar. But we wanted to touch on it and just recognize that this is a part of strategies for Vision Zero also. So zoning codes regulate land use in our communities, basically what, where, and how things get built. And historically, or not historically, in the last 100 years in the US, we have focused on a separation of uses. So saying homes can be over here, industry can be over here. In the downtown, we have businesses and offices, and all these things are in their own zones. And now, in the last 30 plus years, we've been moving more toward, let's say, back toward mixed use with zoning. Mixed use is useful because when we talk about transportation, we're always talking about moving from A to B. And I think we can also get fixed on thinking A and B will always be in set locations. But A and B and the location of A and B are based on our zoning code and they're not fixed. So when uses can be closer together and when we have greater population density, the amount of transportation that's needed is less. Um, and then with your zoning code, you can also require infrastructure with new development or redevelopment of property. So you should require that the uh, property build the sidewalk or build the multi-use path that's in your plan. You should require the dedication of right-of-way with rezoning or subdivisions and require tree plots and pedestrian lighting. All of those are low cost because the city itself isn't paying for them. It is an incremental tactic. I understand this won't redo an entire corridor, but it's always nice to get the increment you can get. Okay, also in terms of zoning, parking can again be an entire webinar and would be a great time. But with your zoning code, strongly encourage you to rethink if you have parking minimums. You can just usually without much fuss change them to maximums. This it would take longer for me to explain, but it is connected because the more parking we have, the more driving is generated in our communities. The parking location on a lot matters too, so it's important to have parking behind the building. And also surface parking lots. I would encourage in downtowns to not allow a surface parking lot as a use. Parking could be accessory to the use that's on the lot, but an entire surface parking lot would have more conflicts with pedestrians and increase parking in downtowns. On-street parking, um, a lot of things are important with on-street parking, but we're going to say just visibility at intersections. So making sure their on-street parking has about 20, 25 feet of non-parking as people approach an intersection to improve visibility for drivers to see pedestrians who want to cross the street. And on-street parking matters in terms of parking demand. So if there's a lot of space dedicated to on-street parking, but it's not getting used, it makes streets wider, visibly wider, and actually wider, and then people drive faster. Okay, also in terms of zoning codes, thinking of driveways, and in a downtown, you could do this in all neighborhoods. If you have alleys, you can require that alley access is used instead of driveways. And why do driveways matter? Because people are driving across the sidewalk. So if people driving across a sidewalk look or don't look for pedestrians, that is dangerous. And also, as pedestrians, it breaks up your sidewalk and makes it a more stressful environment. So, also with driveways, you could reduce the number that are allowed and make them as narrow as possible. Okay, and now we'll switch to Nate.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nate Young, and I am a professional engineer in the Minneapolis office here at Tool Design. I specialize in complete streets, bikeway design, and safe routes to school. And my goal in everything that I do is to create people-centric places that people enjoy as they move from destination to destination in their daily lives. Today, I'll be talking briefly about public space programming and demonstration projects, starting with public space programming. Next. Physical design of a space can create an excellent blank canvas for people to interact with and foster a sense of community. However, a certain spark is required to activate those spaces into places that people want to exist in. While some spaces naturally lend themselves to becoming places, such as parks, playgrounds, and other active locations such as that, much of our existing infrastructure is centered around the automobile instead of people. Various tactics exist to activate these spaces. One of the most common ways that this can happen is by closing streets for events. These events can be festivals, street races such as running, biking, and roller skating races, block parties, and my personal favorite, the farmers market. On the right is a picture of the Hyde Park Farmers Market in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I used to live, which closes off a main arterial for 4 hours every Sunday morning in the summer. I did try to find my own picture of the event, but it turns out I just take a bunch of pictures of my dog sniffing slices of ham in my bag, so I had to take an official picture instead. Another small way to activate spaces is by reclaiming unused parking spaces or other street space for parklets. These parklets can be business specific, such as a street cafe or a streetery, or they can be a public space with benches and plants. Next slide. You can also go big with a street activation by hosting something such as an open streets event. These events are geared towards drawing large crowds and can feature a number of subforms of activation from tents to basketball hoops. This is a good opportunity to engage local organizations such as municipal departments and local nonprofits. Open streets vary from typical street closures in that they are entirely free and accessible to the public. They can be entered or exited at any point and are a new way to explore and view the city. Where open streets intersect with critical traffic streets, intersections can be soft closed, allowing vehicles to progress along the crossing streets as normal, while keeping the open streets closed to motor vehicles. Next slide. Next, we'll talk about what most people tend to think about when it comes to low-cost solutions, and that is demonstration projects. Demonstration projects are temporary, low-cost street installations used to test designs that are new to the community or the region. It's important to frame it's important to frame these projects as demonstration projects instead of test or pilot projects, as they are typically proven solutions and are largely a method of gaining community and local practitioner familiarity and acceptance. Next slide. Demonstration projects typically use materials that are quick and easy to deploy. They don't require a roadway rebuild or repaving, and they can typically be done with city staff. An example is these modular speed cushions, as shown as the left, which allow wider wheelbase vehicles, such as fire trucks, to cut through without deflection, while most vehicles must traverse the actual hump of the cushions. Note that these are a rubberized plastic material that simply bolts down to the pavement and can be installed in a matter of an hour or less with little to no engineering required and only using city staff. Next slide. Demonstration projects can also be used to iterate on a design, such as this example in Bloomington, Indiana, where a neighborhood greenway was enhanced with quick build materials, including bump outs, speed cushions, and temporary paint. At first, the residents were unsure of whether or not these enhancements were necessary, and after years of being installed, the community was simply sick of it. Sick of the look of it, that is. They loved the safety benefit and were clamoring for a permanent, beautiful installation. The city came in afterwards and reinstalled the materials with permanent installations, such as installing bump out chicanes as curved native planters, as seen in the bottom left photo. Next slide. Demonstration projects can also use modular materials, like in this floating bus stop, which allows the bikeway to ramp up, creating a level platform for pedestrians and enhancing accessibility for blind and otherwise disabled users. A benefit of modular materials is that they can be reused. So when the design is transformed into a permanent solution, or if it's decided that it is not in the best place for the design, they can be removed, stored, and reinstalled at a different location. Another sometimes overlooked benefit of utilizing modular systems is that they can be deployed in construction sites. For example, if a buffered bike lane is installed on the street, a floating bus stop can be installed with a modular system in a different location on the block while the permanent bus stop is being renovated. Next slide. Finally, demonstration projects are an opportunity to get people not typically involved with construction projects to pitch in on their own communities. This can be something like letting the community decorate roundabouts and traffic circles, or by having a neighborhood activity to paint crosswalks, bump outs, or other street art. Next slide. And now we'll get started with our panel discussion, which will be a few short presentations followed up with a Q&A.
All right, first up we have Bart with the Village of Shorewood.
Next slide, I presume, or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bart Griepentrog, Planning Director for the Village of Shorewood. I believe this is mostly a local audience, so many of you probably already know me and or the history or development patterns of the Village of Shorewood. But just for reference, I will be talking about our involvement in the county-led Safe Streets and Roads for All demonstration activities. Next slide. So just as a matter of, how we got here is the Jeff, as many of you know, reached out to us all and asked us whether or not we wanted to participate in the demonstration activity project, which the Village of Shorewood and the Village Board was happy to do so because we don't have extra budget typically for these types of projects. And so we were happy to apply for a grant of up to $50,000, which was a local match of $10,000. So our board agreed to participate in that, but because of the timelines of the grant, we didn't necessarily have a large public engagement process leading into what we would do with the money. So we looked to prior planning efforts, specifically our pedestrian and bicycle master plan and our transportation and parking analysis and request program to identify projects that we thought were in line with what the community was asking for and wanted to see tested out on our roadway. For general purposes, we focused on our neighborhood streets, and so our larger corridors of Oakland Avenue and Capitol Drive. A, some of that requires DOT involvement, and B, it's a much bigger involvement in project on those particular streets with respect to the amount of traffic on them. But we do have a lot of requests in neighborhoods for traffic calming activities. So we focused on those, and we identified that we would do horizontal and vertical installations. So with respect to horizontal, in terms of narrowing the roadway or forcing motorists to think more clearly about how they traverse the neighborhoods, we did traffic circles along previously identified neighborhood greenways. One of those is Murray Avenue, which is what Village Hall is on. It's also what the North Shore Fire Department is on. So we had a lot of coordination with respect to emergency services. And we placed them at intersections that we received a lot of requests for four-way stops. Four-way stops are not traffic calming, but we still get those requests to stop or slow people through those intersections. So we identified two of those. We also installed curb extensions in areas where we have received a lot of complaints and or tickets related to people parking too close to the intersection. So we thought that'd be a good way of, requiring that behavior to be utilized with respect to not being able to allow people to park there. We also placed them on routes to elementary schools that did not have crossing guards. And so that would just daylight those intersections for kids needing to get to school. And then lastly, we installed a vertical speed table on a route that is highly known for cut-through traffic for people trying to avoid the intersection of Capitol and Oakland that we've received complaints on for years. And so that's how we identified those projects. Next slide. This is just an overview of the projects, and so we did install something in each of the 4 quadrants of Shorewood. So in the number 9, I'll just start with, that's the cut through that people take to avoid Capitol and Oakland. That's where we installed the speed table. We had wanted to do 2 speed tables per our engineer's request or recommendation, but we did not have enough funding for that. So we only ended up going with 1, which I think in the end we received some feedback on, needing to have more than 1. But once again, in terms of budget, we could not do that. Number 5 and 6 up in the northwest quadrant there near Lake Bluff Elementary School. That's where we installed the curb extensions. And then 7 and 8 on the east side of the village, that is Murray Avenue, which has been identified as a neighborhood greenway, or formerly Bike Boulevard, for people not wanting, necessarily to travel on Oakland Avenue. They can use North Murray Avenue as a less busy street for that. So next slide. As all projects start in Shorewood, we had to get an identified communication plan presented to the village board. This just kind of set expectations and help manage the process. We use pretty typical standard channels of communication, including our project website and a news flash within our village website. We did do neighborhood notices to anyone who lived within 250 feet of an installation, just to give them a heads up and invite comments prior to the installation, to make sure that we weren't missing anything. We also did relatively regular updates through our village manager's memo, which receives 3,200 subscribers. So we get a lot of good coverage on that. We also installed a display board at the village library, which has a lot of walk-in traffic. And so we kind of laid the groundwork for communicating what the purpose of this program was, and managing expectations. We also did social media posts throughout the project, and we will be doing an article in our Shorewood Today magazine, which goes to all addresses, kind of as a finalized report, or a what we learned kind of thing coming out this fall or winter. Within the demonstration activities, we also did an online survey to allow people to submit their comments. The survey generally related to whether or not people thought the installations were effective, and whether or not they had comments on the installation themselves. We received 541 responses, which was pretty high. In comparison to, say, like a planning effort to update the bike ped plan, putting something in the ground or on the street, as it matters, really does get people to provide comments on it. So it was a quite successful survey that we then indexed to kind of get like common themes from each of the installations. Next slide. Once the communication started, we began developing the project. In terms of capacity, the village does not have an in-house engineer, and so we had to use our contracted engineer and do a work order within which the budget was up to $20,000, so not insignificant, but necessary. The engineer was used to design and monitor both pre and post installation traffic at all the installations. Our DPW was utilized to quote, purchase, install, maintain, and remove the equipment. They did track their hours with respect to installing it. It took 4 people over 5 days, 131 hours. So not insignificant in terms of staff capacity, and we were very thankful and happy that they were able to do it. But just keeping in mind that when we plan these projects, we do need to consult our other departments in terms of what help we need. In terms of my involvement, it was largely grant facilitation and public involvement. The police department was utilized throughout the process to monitor the installations and do enforcement as necessary. And then we also did consult with the North Shore Fire Department and School District, just because we knew that these installations would impact their either their operations and or their the children and parents coming to school. With respect to the budget, the traffic circles, the materials for them cost roughly $4,000, and we did 2 of them, so about $8,000 for the materials for those. Curb extensions were just posts drilled into the ground. Those were $1,700, and once again, we did 2 of those. And then the speed table was $1,300, which was quite pricey, but highly effective. We would have liked to do 2 of those, like I mentioned, but we did not have funds for that. So next slide. These are just the engineered plans for what we installed here. So here's one of our traffic circles at Murray and Kensington. Our engineer did design it as at the maximum width possible, just so that we could test out the effectiveness of it. We did once again give this to our fire department and police department prior to installing it to make sure that there were no issues. DPW also reviewed it. All of their vehicles were able to go around it. So we were comfortable and happy with this as the installation. Next slide. This just kind of shows what the final results are. So rubberized curb, cones, signage, things of that nature. So once again, in the middle of the intersection, this is an intersection of where actually 2 neighborhood greenways are projected to intersect. So this is a highly desired intersection for understanding how demonstration activities or traffic calming could work. Next slide. This is a designed drawing of how we install the curb extension. So once again, people generally parking too close to the crosswalks because this is close to a commercial corridor. And so just blocking visibility of the crosswalk and people, trying to get to school or the commercial district. So next slide shows how they were actually installed. Unfortunately, this photo was taken when there wasn't a lot of, cars parked in the street, but in general, Kensington Boulevard near Oakland Avenue does have those issues. And so this once again just prevents people from parking too close to the intersection. It does also narrow the roadway, but it doesn't narrow it more than 2 cars being parked on either side. So in summer conditions, Kensington does allow parking on both sides of the street. And so this kind of just once again forces the cars away from the intersection, but doesn't actually, narrow the roadway more than 2 cars parked would have. Next slide. And this, once again, this is the speed table, pretty standard speed table. If you go to the next slide, it shows the installation of it. By and large, people were quite happy with this as the installation. I think we've received a lot of requests for speed humps in the past, and people were quite happy that they finally saw the village, responding to that by testing this out. So this took a lot of work to install. I think there might be, thousands of bolts that it took to get that down there. And there is some concern by DPW of what the roadway will look like when it gets removed. So things to keep in mind, but it's been very stable. There's been no maintenance requirements or issues in any of our installations. So we're happy with that as well. Next slide. This is just kind of the public feedback we received. So as I mentioned, we did a survey when the projects were installed. All of them sought to see whether or not people thought they were effective. Traffic circles, 56% of people thought they were effective. That's higher than those who didn't, because we had a lot of people that said, they weren't comfortable responding to that. But so 56% was quite high. But that being said, the comments also allowed people to submit, any issues they had with them. So when we compiled them into general themes, there was some discussion of confusion with traffic control and enforcement. So once we installed them, people started using them perhaps as roundabouts and ignoring stop signs and yield signs that, were previously in place and kept in place. And so just being able to communicate to people, that traffic control still needs to be followed, and review with our engineer to make sure that traffic control was installed properly. Some people thought they were too large. As I mentioned, we had installed them as the largest size possible. But because of that, people thought that the vehicles were impacting crosswalks, and that larger vehicles were, swerving too much to get around the circle, and perhaps, making it less pedestrian or bike friendly. And then lastly, we did receive, the usual complaints that people did not think they were necessary. They questioned the location. People didn't like the aesthetics. So just be able to manage those expectations and respond to those as you get them when they come in. Something to keep in mind. The curb extensions received less effective ratings, but they were seen as more effective than not when the data was reviewed. Largely, people didn't find them effective because many people were confused what they were. They didn't quite understand that the intention was to keep people from parking away from the crosswalks. When there's no one parked there, they kind of don't, necessarily make themselves self-evident. So public communication of what those were definitely necessary. Some people thought the roadway was too narrowed, but once again, it was not narrowed any further than two parked cars. And then lastly, people once again thought they were unnecessary, ugly, or not bike friendly because they made the bike go into the middle of the roadway as opposed to staying on the side near the curb. But once again, if a car was parked there, the bike would do the same thing. And then lastly, the speed table was seen as the most effective. However, some people did question its location being too close to the intersection. They wanted it further into the neighborhood. As I mentioned, we wanted to do 2, we could not do 2. We had a lot of comments on whether or not 1 was enough. So people did definitely want more than 1. And then there were comments on whether or not it was dangerous to vehicles and would cause damage, was it was visible at night. And then once again, people thinking it was not bike friendly because it didn't leave space for the bike lane to be traveled without having to go over it. So that's the general feedback we received. And then the last slide that I have talks about the quantitative results that we had. So there had been questions throughout the project about whether or not these things were needed. And so we did collect pre-installation data. And in general, the 85th percentile of speeds within these neighborhoods was seen as, okay. It was slightly higher than the posted speed limits, but not excessively. However, the maximum speeds that we registered were quite unacceptable. And so In general, these traffic calming efforts were seen as very successful in terms of curbing reckless driving or the occasional person who thinks it's acceptable to drive 40 miles per hour through these neighborhoods. Those definitely were brought down with the installation of these devices. And then in general, the percentage of drivers exceeding speed limits in each of the locations went down from 31 to 38% down to 27, 28, et cetera. On Morris, where the speed table was, it went from 19% to 55% down to 3 or 33%. So we're quite happy with the results in terms of actually slowing traffic. And then lastly, one of our comments in our survey was, do you believe the village should pursue additional installations? And by and large, overwhelming 65% compared to 19% did think that we should pursue this. So in terms of our next steps, we now need to, as Beth mentioned, identify budget funds to continue doing these types of things, whether they're temporary or permanent with capital improvements. So we're happy and very, very thankful that the county offered us the opportunity to participate in the program.
Okay, thank you so much, Bart. Um, and just a note, we anybody can submit a question in the chat, and once we go through each panelist presentation, we'll go over the questions that people have submitted. Okay, so thanks. Now we have Bradley with City of Chicago.
Cool. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bradley Topol, City of Chicago. I work in the Complete Streets group here, and I have primarily been focusing on bicycle, pedestrian, safety, transit type projects for the last 15 years, primarily in Chicago, but also with a several-year stint on the West Coast for Seattle. So happy to meet you all and looking forward to presenting. So next slide. Keep moving to our first example. Next slide, please. There we go. Perfect. So I'm here just to I'm going to focus primarily on kind of bump outs or curb extension design, just because from a quick build or easy to implement Vision Zero, these are kind of what I view as like the easiest things to get started with if your communities are starting with your first locations or you're kind of trying to expand from some of your initial locations. I do use the word pilot in this presentation, even though we don't use it at the City of Chicago here anymore, but it's just meant to communicate, like, if it's your first time working through these things, it can take a little bit of extra effort to kind of get things rolling. Here's an example of kind of our standard bump out kind of treatment that we use. That's like what we call paint and post, but that's also like quick build. Historically, we would just do the striping on the outside, the white lines and the white posts. With more recent installations over the last several years, as we've had more available budget, we will usually fill in the bump out with some sort of color. And in this case, we use a product called MMA, which stands for methyl methacrylate, which is just a really durable surface coating. So it really resists wear and tear. It's easy to clean. So when it rains, sometimes the color can pop again after a big rainstorm because it'll wash right off. Next example, please. We've also tried, this shows an example of kind of a quick build pedestrian refuge island. We only have a couple of those in the city, and we are kind of moving forward with permanent concrete installations. We've done them in a few locations, but usually it's been where we know we're going to come through with additional capital work in the future and kind of install a more permanent design. These can just get a little more banged around. The posts can get knocked down a little easier, and it just, as a pedestrian, the experience is, while they're worth trying and trying out, we have typically they just haven't worked out as well as a like pedestrian refuge space. So, but another example of something you can try on, maybe this is a very high volume, multi-lane arterial. I bet they would be much better on a one lane each direction arterial, maybe at an uncontrolled intersection where you have lower volumes. Next slide, please. Here's just another example of some of the infill we've done, and this was kind of a community effort here where we worked with some local community members to kind of help design some additional treatments that pop a little more. This is using a slightly different product called thermoplastic. The advantage with using a product like that is you can like custom design almost anything, and then the manufacturer can just give them to you in these panels that they just torch down. They kind of melt them to the ground. But that gives a lot more flexibility in like custom designs or working with community members to kind of increase that engagement and kind of increase that ownership from the public. Next slide, please. So what's the advantage of going with bump outs or something similar as a quick build option, you can design really quick. So with like Bart was saying, they did have to use like an engineer, but it's really easy to design these things. You're not touching the ADA ramps, you're not touching drainage inlets, you're not moving around the curb lines. So really, it really is just at the end of the day, once you have a design, it can be some paint and some posts and possibly some other like temporary curb elements like Bart was showing in that roundabout. He had those kind of rubberized curbs or something. You could also do something like that with this as well. So it just makes it easier to design, easier for the public to swallow if there's a little bit of trepidation. It's a type of thing that you can say, well, if it really doesn't work, we can pop these things out, or at the minimum, you can pop the posts out or something. It just helps people get a little more familiar with that, or lowers that barrier of entry to kind of something like this, increases the comfort with the public. And like I mentioned, there's opportunities to like once you get several on the ground and you kind of start rolling with this, you can have more public engagement to kind of increase that public ownership of these designs in these communities. In Chicago, we do, while the preference is always to do what we would call permanent, but like concrete and hardscape and things like that, we still do many and many of these locations, even with new projects, just because funding wise, it is a lot cheaper. We can build 10 bump outs for the cost of one concrete one. And so a lot of times it's not uncommon if we know that there will be capital work in the next 5 to 8 years that we will come through, install these to get the safety benefit now, and then maybe if there's resurfacing coming through or a water main or some other utility work coming through in the future, we can work with them to, when they rip up the whole road, install a more permanent design when they're already doing resurfacing and replacing sidewalk and similar types of work. And they're really beneficial. They increase pedestrian visibility, they slow vehicles by making the space feel narrower, and they shorten that crossing distance and reduce that pedestrian exposure. Next slide, please. So where do you start? How do you actually figure out where to put these? In Chicago, we've been doing them for about 15-ish years, since about around when I started here was when they really kind of took us a few years to kind of really get a process in place, but they are now kind of a standardized thing that are seen in a lot of places. And so now we get a lot of requests because there's a lot of high level of comfort with our council members and with the public who work through the council members to request locations. Anytime we're doing capital work, resurfacing projects, or other types of corridor work or things like that, we will generally try to include bump outs of some kind, either or curb extensions, either a paint and post quick build option if there's funding or drainage issues, or we'll kind of strive to do that more permanent concrete, but more expensive and more challenging to design. And then we also kind of specifically target locations throughout the city, just kind of based on, we have kind of a citywide safety and equity analysis that we use to guide us in a specific direction and kind of highlight certain communities or specifically school areas where we'll do a lot of locations in kind of a denser, maybe 4x4 block radius. We'll actually like do 10 or 12 locations in that area to kind of make it this kind of change the neighborhood dynamic and feel of that place. Next slide, please. So how should you prioritize or pilot, figure out where to put your first location, your first demonstration project locations? There really is no wrong answer. It just kind of is, how are you going to justify those locations and how are you going to message it? So you could do it based off of, I have in the bottom, I have reactive and proactive metrics. You can do things like looking at where your crashes are happening, where your pedestrian crash is happening, where do you have high speed crashes, which may be indicative of higher risk factors. You can just look at your streets that are just barriers between communities because they're high speed roads, or maybe they're multiple lanes or things like that, and they're already difficult to cross. You can look at equity factors if your communities are doing, looking at rates of poverty or neighborhoods that have been historically underrepresented or things like that. And then like the traditional schools, parks, pedestrian destinations, those can be really easy to start with because it's harder to argue against where this is a safety for children or something like that. Like that's always really can be an easier piece to stand on, that we're doing it in this area where we know children are crossing and we want them to be visible and we want that crossing to be shorter and we want people to slow down in those areas. So there's no wrong way to do it. It's just kind of how are you messaging and talking about that with the public and your elected officials. Next slide, please. So here I have a couple examples. These are kind of some of our bigger, maybe a little more wow examples here, but this is an example from, we have a lot of six-way intersections in the city of Chicago. And so you'll see here that there's numerous kind of slip lanes here. I think the ones on the bottom and the right are they're already stating maybe some of our construction materials there in advance in this aerial, but was a place where as a pedestrian crossing, there's a lot of you're crossing to a little island, then to another spot, and there's kind of some yield conditions in play. I think actually in this slide, I'm realizing now you can actually already start to see there's like shadows of the posts out there that are starting to outline our bump out. So this is right as construction is starting, but you can still see that original layout of the intersection. Next slide, please. Here is after we installed. So we did go with kind of a decorative design out here. Again, this was working somewhat with the community, but I think we also hired an artist to help us kind of design and implement, but was, a lot of community engagement in this because it was such a big change. But again, just paint. This is just typical materials, paint and post. So we're using, typical pavement marking materials for those edge lines. I think the colorization, the blue and green, I think that is just like, it's not even like a traffic rated paint because you're not having vehicles drive over that. So maybe it's an even cheaper material when you can kind of paint something inside. But again, right, we're getting rid of all those slip lanes and we're just kind of tightening up that intersection, shortening those crossing distances. Let's go to the next slide, please. So that was 2015 and then 2022. So 6 to 7 years later, we knew that some capital improvements were going to eventually make their way here that were already kind of in the initial planning, and funding had started to be set aside when we did the polka dot pattern. So we knew that eventually as that paint wore away and some of those, we started having more maintenance issues where those posts do fall down over time and they get banged up. We knew that more capital work was going to come through eventually. And so then this is kind of the permanent design that we see out there today. Still maintaining some of that fun kind of circle polka dot material, again, that was designed intentionally to kind of just break up the space and make it feel a little more playful. Next slide, please. Another example of a 6-lane intersection where we just kind of focused on 6-legged intersection where we focused on a specific slip lane here. Next slide, please. So came through, added striping. The tan is that methyl methacrylate MMA pavement marking. In this case, we also worked with the local business association and they supplied and maintained the planters there. So they were the ones who were making sure that they were funding the landscaping company to come out and make sure it was getting watered and planted and it always looked nice. So it kind of added that extra pop to this. Next slide, please. And then coming through 5 years after that, with a permanent concrete design there. They did the planters, they got shifted to the other side of the street, but you could do more with this space. You could add a cafe space there, or you could do some activations. I've actually seen bands play on this corner where they just bring an amp and they just like play live music in the community, which is kind of fun. So it just gives you that extra space and flexibility to do stuff with. But it's all this kind of progression of as you get in initial improvements, always be keeping an eye on what are the capital projects, water main work, resurfacing work that are going to be happening in the far future, because you can have all those community conversations and discussions with businesses now with an easier to implement treatment. And then when capital work comes through or higher dollar projects come through, it's you barely have to, you alert them, you tell them about it, but you don't have to have it's not a bigger discussion anymore. It's already accepted that this space is a pedestrian space and it's easier to implement these types of designs. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to kind of show another flare we use in Chicago where we want to build concrete, but this is where like drainage is really problematic, or building AD ramps. It's like we have maybe a little more money or we want a bigger impact than like paint and post. We do this treatment, we call it detached concrete bump outs, because you still have a gutter channel there. But we do this a lot around schools. This is one of those treatments where we want to do 10 or 8 locations around a school at like the 4 corners, and then maybe a broader ring around that on like the school routes. But we don't have enough money to do these really beefy bump outs. So this is kind of our in-between design where it is still hardscape. Allows the signage to move out, which also makes it feel a lot narrower too. And and provides a safe crossing without the added cost of moving drainage and doing new ADA ramps. Slide, please. And another example, because we have so many one-ways in the city of Chicago, here's kind of just another flare on that example of how we'll do it on both sides of the street normally. And even if it was a two-way, we would still do a design very similar to this. But we like to focus them on the approaches as people are coming to a stop to kind of further increase that stop control. Next slide, please. And just here's another example where we worked with a neighborhood association who really wanted to do some sort of beautification. So we just put in the curb and then added the dirt, and they came in and maintained their own plantings. It's hard to tell on the slide, but they're actually on both sides of the street. Here's plantings on the left side as well. And so that was kind of their choice to beautify the intersection. We just have like a very simple maintenance agreement that we sign with those neighborhood groups just to make sure that they maintain things over time. But again, another flare on an option. Go ahead, please keep going. Next slide. So I want to kind of talk about costs, at least what it costs for us in the city of Chicago. Our paint and post curb extension can be $2K to $5K. It's about $2,000 if you don't do that colorization on the interior, and that's about $5,000 if you do some sort of MMA or thermoplastic marking in there. If we do a fully attached concrete design, that can be up to $50,000, depending on drainage and things. But a lot of times we do have to kind of shift some drainage structures around. We try not to if we don't have to, but it happens every now and then. So that can be even higher than $50K, depending on how that works out. And then the detached example I showed was about $12K. So we can typically get about 10 paint posts bump outs for a permanent one. And then maybe like 4 detached for a permanent one. So still trying to stretch our dollars all the time with many of our projects. I will say that us as the Complete Streets Group, that we rarely actually pay for and build our own permanent bump outs. We do use our other capital projects in the city to mainly fund those. Next slide, please. And so I kind of tried to map out like what has our progression been in the city of Chicago, what has the progression been in other communities that I've worked in, and just kind of this is like kind of a generic roadmap for any type of treatment that you do, whether it's this, bike lanes, or other types. Change is always hard, and there's always, and even internally, like internally within a municipality and externally or with council members, there's always like anytime you change something or do something new, there's always kind of those growing pains and getting people used to that and getting more comfortable with those types of things. So I would say that this is true of many different, many different types of treatments that you can do. But the whole point is get some stuff on the ground. Usually you're going to base those off of some sort of safety concern. Again, that was that prioritization we talked about. You're going to get a mixed public opinion, kind of like what Bart was getting at. You can do public surveys, and there's always going to be, obviously the people who respond or the people who call to either complain or critique or compliment are always going to be the most outspoken people in a community. There's always going to be a huge percentage of people that just don't comment or reach out. But you can get mixed reviews of those things. But as you kind of expand those locations, you can always kind of point backwards. So you can point back to those initial locations and say, look, these are great. They're a benefit, or at the very worst, they're not inhibiting anything. Like fire trucks can still use those things. It's not inhibiting movements. It's just encouraging slower speeds and safer behaviors. You also have opportunities again to like engage the public and make them part of the process. And then as you kind of move on, as you get more and more locations, the public gets a lot more comfortable. They're less questioning. They just kind of start to expect these at some point during the process. And then you kind of get to that point where there's enough around and enough people see the benefits that they start kind of actively requesting it. And that's this kind of like feedback loop where now you don't even have to really justify individual locations. You just say, we've already proved this is a proven safety treatment that we do, and we're just going to do them everywhere we can, or wherever we have budget or other capital project where this is just going to be part of our standard toolkit. That's what's happened in the city of Chicago. When I worked for the city of Seattle, a similar thing kind of happened throughout my tenure there too, where justification became less and less needed over time, and the public just kind of accepted it as a standard treatment. And that was also based off our messaging. Every time we did it, we were always messaging the benefits of those types of things. But the investment of staff time per location goes down over time as the public gets more comfortable with these types of treatments. Next slide, please. And I just threw out here, Bart was getting at how Shoreline Right does not have a staff engineer and how there may be, this is an example taken from our Chicago standards. Here we have a lot of diagonal streets, so we used a skewed intersection here just for an example. But there may be benefit in just developing a standard detail with your communities or maybe working with the county to kind of say, hey, generically, we can have this standard detail. And so then when you want to build something, you don't always necessarily have to have as much engineering staff time to design every single location. You may have like neighborhood streets that are typically the same width, or intersections that are very similar, or crossings that are very similar along a corridor. And maybe you can just take a standard detail that you've worked on and just kind of plug and play that in a lot of locations. So that may be a good tactic for communities that are, where it's difficult to get engineering staff for kind of projects like this. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to kind of reference some of these guides for those of you that are trying to get more comfortable with this or get others in your organization more comfortable. These two are really good guides that just kind of show some really cool examples around the country of what other groups have done and what other cities have, how they've piloted these things, how they funded them, what's been the process across kind of a multitude of geographies and population densities. So I think that is it for my presentation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Bradley. Now we have Ember with Our Streets Minneapolis. Ready when you are. Ember, you are muted.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, I'm Ember with Our Streets, formerly Our Streets Minneapolis. We changed our name recently because we do statewide work. And I am the events coordinator or events manager for all of our stuff. Do you have my slides? Great, thank you. And I'm here to talk to you today about open streets. So you might be familiar with these street closure events that open close streets to car traffic and open them to folks to bike, walk, roll, experience their streets in a new and different way. Next slide. So just a little bit about me and about Our Streets. I've been programming at Our Streets for 4 years. I produced 13 Open Streets Minneapolis events and some other block party activation events. And then Our Streets, my organization, we're a transportation advocacy nonprofit. We work to put people first by transforming transportation and infrastructure in the city and at the state level. Next slide. So Open Streets. This is a photo from Open Streets Lindale, which was the first ever Open Streets event. And I think you can click through, got maybe some animations in there. Yeah, give me one more click. Yeah, so Open Streets, it's something that started internationally. Cyclovia in Bogota, Colombia in 1974. That's been really successful. They close streets to car traffic and open them to people every Sunday, which I think that weekly model is very cool. But here in Minneapolis, our first Open Streets event occurred on Lindale, which you see in the photo in 2011. Next slide. So what's Open Streets? Well, in Minneapolis, this is a program that closes major thoroughfares to car traffic. And at our events, so they happen on different corridors, just one-day events. So Lindale, it's like 11 to 5 p.m., close about 3 miles of city street. And we have vendors and stages and performers, lots of engagement from nonprofit groups, from city groups, and brings a variety of different folks and organizations together to create something that celebrates the community and gives people the opportunity to imagine what streets could be like if we centered people first. Next slide. So this is just a little bit of a breakdown of what our attendance has looked like at Open Streets. This only goes through 20. So Open Streets is still ongoing in Minneapolis. Our Streets is just no longer involved, so that's why we only have data through 2023. But we peaked with 8 events in 2017. But you can see around that peak, we were having attendance of like 100,000 people each summer, which is really amazing. Have a lot of folks, a lot of stories of folks who, would come to these events annually with their kids, like have really great memories growing up. Um, People who came to Open Streets events and are like, this is why I moved to the city. Like I came here and like I was really actively able to connect with community and see how I fit in. And so they're a really unique event that kind of showcases commercial corridors and cultural corridors in a way that really no other event I've seen in Minneapolis can. Next slide. And you just click all the way through here. So we've got a couple different goals for Open Streets Minneapolis. First, inspire active, accessible transportation through biking, walking, and rolling. Minneapolis has a lot of pretty great bike lane infrastructure, but even so, it can be pretty intimidating for folks to start using bike commuting or biking on the street. And so this is a really kind of easy way for folks to get out to sort of experience what the infrastructure is like and also just freely move about their streets without, worrying about cars. I think one of the best features of Open Streets event is opportunities for engagement. There are a lot of organizations, city departments that kind of plan their engagement around the Open Streets events. It's a really great way to connect directly with people in the community, and especially great to connect with people about upcoming transportation decisions and projects that are coming to the area. So you can, at Open Streets, sometimes, we'd model like different street designs so folks could interact with those and give feedback and talk directly with an engineer or a designer and sort of share more about what they would want to see and what that looks like. And we do that in a really fun environment. I think it can be really difficult to get engagement. I think as all of you are probably aware about some of these projects, it can feel really dense and like people are busy and they have other things to do. So when you have a really fun, exciting event with other ways to draw folks, it's a great way to be able to connect. Open Streets is a really amazing way to grow community partnerships and build trust, not only between city and different organizations, but connecting communities with each other. A really great example, I think, is Open Streets Cedar Riverside here in Minneapolis, which was kind of like a historic neighborhood here in the city that has a lot of different immigrants, a lot of different cultures, and kind of has like had a lot of change like over the course of its existence in the city. And that event has been going on for a couple years now, but have like 50 different businesses and organizations and groups that all come together and like meet to talk about what they want to do with Open Streets. And so this is kind of a low pressure way for folks to like connect on things that are important to them in this one single event and builds relationships and builds connections. Open Streets is a great way to support vibrant and diverse arts and culture. So we'd open calls to musicians, to artists. We would have makers markets that supported local entrepreneurs. We did have a fee structure for participation, and I didn't include this in this presentation, but happy to answer more questions about that. So the highest cost to participate was for like corporations or organizations that were not based in the state, with kind of concentric circles down all the way to like, are you a local entrepreneur who lives in this neighborhood? You can participate for $15 and we'll also provide you a tent and a table. And we determined that based on conversations with community members and with arts organizations and small business support organizations to really make sure that these events were accessible and were a bonus to community and not putting a burden on small businesses and entrepreneurs. And kind of feeding right into that, I think, kind of already touched on stimulating local businesses, supporting local crafters and entrepreneurs is a big part of these events. Next slide. So here's just kind of a map of how Open Streets is organized and all the different folks that are involved in making that happen. At least when Our Streets was involved, the structure's slightly different now, and I can answer any questions about that as I'm able. So Open Streets, it's an initiative of the City of Minneapolis. And then Our Streets was the organization that managed all of it. And now partnering with individual neighborhood organizations is how it happens now. But contract with the city to organize the events through a public service agreement. And the way that this is set up, and I think the way that it a lot of other Open Streets or Cyclovia events sometimes organize this, is the city provides some of that operational support through road closures, traffic control, permits, and then the organizer kind of plans the rest of it, does all the community engagement, the organization, the coordination, the registration, and then also partnering with co-presenters. So we would, sort of manage the whole event, and that was really helpful for vendors and partners so that each time they engaged with an event, that was a standardized process and they could like register for them all at once. But then we would partner with local organizations to co-present. So making sure that each of those events is a really accurate reflection of the community and the values and priorities of the folks who live there. And a tier down, community partners. So that's like maybe your work group who's like talking about programming stages or like where we want to put the makers market or which small businesses we want to engage with or what driveways we want to make sure not to block. And those folks all contribute to the process as well. And then, of course, sponsors for the event, variety of different organizations that support the event monetarily. A bunch of volunteers are mobilized to do this event every year, and that really kind of a big backbone of the event and making it happen. And then you've got all your participants, so your vendors, performers, makers, nonprofits, all the folks who come out to the street. Next slide. So here is just a budget breakdown of what the kind of total costs look like, both from our street side as the organizer and from like a city perspective. So you can kind of see the breakdown there. I think the biggest number is the payroll, is the staff. And you could definitely, so every Open Streets event is different. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Since Open Streets Minneapolis events are more highly programmed, with lots of tents and vendors and activities and stages, it requires more coordination. And we're doing about 5 events a year, so that's a lot of work for each event. And it's really important to have adequate staff to support these events, or the experience for folks will not be as positive. Folks need to be able to have someone to talk to see what's going on, and folks who are really focused on making sure that the logistics run well. And so I do think that piece is really important, but you can definitely find different models or way of paying for this. If you have a big sponsor come in, that's always helpful. Or if you do a lower programmed Open Streets, you may not need as much staffing. Next slide. So this is an example, it's kind of turned on its side here, of what an Open Streets Minneapolis event might look like. So again, this is Open Streets Cedar Riverside. This is just a section of the route. But you can see some of those pink areas are like different like activities. So we've got like a mobile museum. We've got Twin City Skaters came out and like provided skate rentals for folks. Different stages, lots of different booths and tables. The blue ones are tents that were provided. The black outlines are tents that folks brought themselves. But yeah, so you can see like really like vibrant festival atmosphere created at these events. Next slide. And here are some photos from Open Street Cedar Riverside. So you can see, I think that like central photo looking down, I think is a really great example of sort of like what it feels like to be on an open street. And this street and a lot of the open streets are streets that like, are not necessarily like super comfortable for folks to like walk or move around on. And I think that's really impactful on commercial corridors. I think like, I don't know if this is probably something that y'all experience is sometimes when you do like pedestrian friendly improvements, you might have to like lose a parking space or two. And I think you're going to be like, oh, well, that's going to lose this business. And it's like, well, no, like actually, a lot of folks are walking, they're biking, they want to be present on your street, they want to be, playing and, sitting and, having a coffee. And if you design streets for folks to be on, they come there. And I think open streets kind of can be a great example of how that can work, and that, if if you build it, they will come model. Next slide. And here are just some responses from folks who have participated in open streets. I think these are from 2023. But I think a lot of these came from, a couple of these are from Open Streets West Broadway, which is in North Minneapolis. And sometimes that corridor, can get a lot of bad press, about violence or about it not being a good place to be. But doing the events, that is the opposite of what you see on open streets days. And you really see the community come out and connect with each other. And so I think that can also be a big factor. If you're looking at equity, when you activate streets and make them, exciting and like places that people feel comfortable to be on, it can be something that can reduce crime and make people feel safer. I think something that we found at the Open Streets events, we never, they weren't, like very, just by nature of programming the street, we had very low incidence of, any sort of, anything that would need to be like escalated, any crime that was like not ever a problem for us at open streets. People are there to have fun and be with each other. And since there's a lot of people around, that kind of just creates a great, safe atmosphere. But yeah, I think really great at giving folks the opportunity to see themselves in their community, to see themselves in their neighborhood, and to imagine what streets could be like. Again, if we design them for people. Next slide. And I'll just kind of a short bit here. So I've talked mostly about what Open Streets Minneapolis is like, but there's a lot of ways to do open streets. So I think a really amazing program is the New York Open Streets program. They do 200 to 300 locations a year, and have weekly street closures. But these are through really local partnerships, like streets and neighborhood organizations and residents apply to close down their street. And these have been really effective. They provide safe spaces for children to play, spaces for community members to gather. There's really can be a real lack of third space and places for people to connect. And so having those regular opportunities is just really cool. And I think a lot of what the city does or what New York does is, kind of support the street closure. And then I think all the programming is mostly run by individuals. I want to mention school streets. So I don't think this has not been adopted as much in the United States, but it is something that I think is really effective. And I think as Brad was saying, I think sometimes, these safety changes or initiatives can be a little bit easier to digest when it's centered around keeping children safe. So these school streets programs create car-free environments at the beginning and the end of the school days. And that has really improved safety outcomes for folks and for children during that time, increases folks taking bikes or using alternative modes of transportation besides cars. So those have been really effective. And Play Street was where I saw that exists in Wauwatosa, which is exciting. You have one of your, I think maybe your first initiative happening there. But again, resident-led street closures. A little bit more reminiscent of National Night Out, in that, it's a closure of a neighborhood street. And, neighbors just are able to come out, connect with each other. And again, a lower cost option because it's just creating space on the street. And then, neighbors bring out chalk or like have a potluck, and can just, again, be a really nice opportunity for third space that is led by residents. Next slide. And then I'll just leave with this. So on the previous slide, each of those examples also like have links to those open streets initiatives or different kinds of initiatives where you can learn more. But I've also linked to this open streets toolkit that was made by 880 is the organization. They're not doing a lot to sort of like actively support open streets initiatives at this point, but they have resources that are extant on their website from, kind of when this initiative was really getting going in North America. And that toolkit is still a great resource, kind of talks about all the ins and outs of what you need to consider when you're building your own open streets program. And I think the one other thing that I will mention as we're thinking about different types of street closures, kind of missed it on the previous slide. I think another really great opportunity is if you have streets that are like adjacent to parks or like a parkway along the river, those can be another great kind of like maybe doesn't need as much programming. People will just come out and ride their bikes because of it being adjacent to a natural resource or a park. But there's my contact information. Please do reach out to me if you have any follow-up questions.
Thank you so much, Ember. We have some questions that we want to send to the panelists. Amber, I'm going to start with one for you that you put the budget for, kind of an approximate budget for an event. And I wondered with that budget, is there a certain street distance that you're assuming and kind of what that is?
Yeah, so I think that would be more for like at least a 2 mile closure that's pretty highly programmed. All the open streets in Minneapolis are on like pretty dense commercial or cultural corridors. So there's a lot of stakeholders that need to be engaged, that need to be informed. And so, yeah, if you did a smaller street closure, if you did like half a block, you would definitely have lower costs.
Yeah, got it. Everything's scaled.
Yes.
Great. Okay, I have another question, I think, for all of our panelists, if you all are willing to answer. When you install a temporary or demonstration project or host an event closing a street, I think I've done this. We receive pushback or complaints, and I'm wondering if you could share kind of your mindset or philosophy to taking in those complaints and how do you use them? Do they change the project? Just what is your overall approach to that and your best advice to others? I'll go in the order that people presented if you feel ready to start, Bart.
Sure. I think how we handle that mostly is through communication plans. Like I mentioned, that's been a huge toolkit of ours to make sure that when these events or activities take place, we make it very clear to elected officials and or other stakeholders how we plan to communicate those, how we take in comments. And then at the end of the project, similar like we did with the demonstration activities, we collect comments throughout, and then we'll have like a finalized report at the end of things to either learn from how to either better communicate, how to modify things. But it's definitely a matter of communication and managing expectations. As you've mentioned, as all panelists have mentioned, there's always going to be someone who doesn't like something, right? But it's a matter of weighing that amongst the benefits and the other comments. And so, yeah, definitely being transparent and clear on how you're communicating, taking in those comments, and then how you present them as a finalized report to the stakeholders, I think is really critical for how we manage things here in Shorewood.
We have done our fair share of open streets in Chicago as well. And again, you will always receive complaints. No matter what you do, anything, everything, you will get complaints. So that should never be a justification to not do something. I'd say that to some extent, like be a little flexible if you're able, like we do with any of our projects or even open streets, we can accommodate certain needs and we can be flexible to a degree within things. And so that's always like people are sometimes surprised that we can't accommodate things. They think things are a done deal. So if you have flexibility to like slightly accommodate or do stuff, that really helps a lot. Other than that, we always just like we have our whatever your rationale for doing that. You have your set talking points. Just stick to those. Just keep sticking to those. If it's some one-off thing, just rabbit holing can always happen. There's a million rabbit holes that anybody can throw at and try to stick on the wall. But these things have benefit, and just keep going forward with it. It's the right call.
Ember, do you have any thoughts on approach? Yeah. You are muted again. Oh, are you able to unmute, Ember? Oh, there. Sorry. Let's see.
Yeah, it's
Okay, sorry.
the host doesn't allow
Sorry.
to unmute.
Okay,
So,
sorry.
yeah, I think, as the co-presenters said, you will always, have somebody who doesn't want to see this happen, right? But I would say, in my experience, a lot of times, like thinking back, like it's maybe like one like really outspoken business owner, like on a pretty long stretch of street. And that person, is often like pretty vocal with sharing their thoughts, but you get a lot more folks who are really excited about it. And sometimes those folks are less likely to communicate with you. That's why I think doing surveys to follow up and like, sort of like receive that feedback that way is really great. And we've found through surveys that these are like wildly popular. Like people really want to see them happen. But I think part of, making sure that, folks know what's going on and aren't surprised. I think as the other panelists said, is communication. And I think with businesses especially is like making sure that like, they have access to we're not blocking off access points or, for restaurants, like we're not putting, food trucks right in front of them, so like that kind of thing. And I think, having individual conversations and communications with folks, is really important. And so we've found that partnering with, business associations and neighborhood associations, so that folks can use their relationships as well to make sure that we kind of have like a touch point, which with each of these locations along the route has really been helpful in kind of getting ahead of problems so that folks feel heard and informed before the event happens.
Love it. That's all great advice. I think it's wonderful. I'm going to add just the tiniest note too, and to build on just everything you all said. One of the examples that Nate shared in the presentation was from my community, and it was just a neighborhood greenway where we installed the temporary materials with traffic calming. And I would say the negative input I received like shook my world as a planner. And I think just learning to try to evaluate and give some time for this window where you're going to get a lot of reactivity, but try to evaluate, is this sometimes people don't like speed cushions because they work, because they have to go slower. So is the nature of the complaint about somebody not liking it because it's working, or is there something you can iterate on the design, but still maintain the purpose of the project? So if you are iterating on the design, not just because and I know that's not what Bradley was suggesting at all. Just trying to think like sometimes if you can and it makes sense and it's still value aligned with the project, by all means iterate. But if sometimes you'll just have people who don't like it just because they have to go a lot slower around a turn, and that's what we want them to do. And so, too bad. Like this is the safer street, and I know we noted this earlier, and the panelists all touched on it. a real beauty of I'm going to stop in 1 second and Jeff will say thank you, of temporary and demonstration projects is you get that complaint and the really negative feedback really early. And if you get to keep it in the ground for as long as possible, it's shifting the status quo of the street. And so when you come back with the permanent project later, it is like everybody said, an expectation to keep it instead of the argument, why are we doing this? And that's like what I love, love, love about demonstration projects. Okay, thanks for having us. And Jeff, do you want to wrap us up? I have to let you unmute. Yes. Oh, this is tricky. Okay.
All right, awesome. Wow, thank you, our panelists. What an amazing job. So motivational. So thank you to Bart, and Brad and Ember. You know, Milwaukee, we definitely need up here to really rethink our streets, you know, and really change the culture. And you three are really exemplifying different ways that we could do that. So just very thankful to each of you, and thanks for Tool. Just you know, once again for organizing this, you know, and really getting all of us at the same table throughout the county. Really great time once again. And so, you know, Milwaukee County, we have a vision of eliminating fatalities and serious injuries on our streets by 2037. It's really going to take all of us. And so, once again, thanks for coming out on this webinar. We should have at least one more in the coming weeks. So, yeah, stay tuned. But thanks again, and have a great day.